Welcome to our conversation about the legal system's role in education policy. I'm Anna Richo, and I'm General Counsel for Cargill, as well as a member of the Board of Directors for Twin Cities Diversity in Practice and WILD. As legal professionals and lawyers, we have a heightened level of responsibility to our fellow citizens, especially those who are oppressed, discriminated against, or disenfranchised, including the youngest amongst us. That's why I'm so glad we're having this conversation today about the role of the legal system in education. It is unbelievable and heartbreaking to know that Minnesota leads the nation in education gaps by race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. And it's not just some parts of Minnesota. These gaps are present in all 87 Minnesota counties. The gaps aren't new. They've persisted for decades. Reducing these disparities at an early age is critical if we hope to make meaningful and lasting change. So, what role should the legal system play in helping to reduce these disparities? Throughout our state's history, the legal system has been a part of the conversation. When our state was formed in 1857, the Minnesota Constitution included an education clause, which stated that it was the state government's responsibility to establish a general and uniform system of public schools. Almost 30 years ago, in 1993, in Skeen versus State, the Minnesota Supreme Court considered a complaint attacking educational financing. The court ultimately held that the funding system, while not perfect, withstood constitutional scrutiny. But Skeen only focused on the funding levels across school districts. It did not address student achievement and performance. Today, we're going to hear from two former Minnesota Supreme Court justices on how the legal system can help close some of the achievement gaps across Minnesota schools through the proposed Page Amendment. We can and we must take action. And I am thrilled to introduce our moderator for this program, Senator Michelle Benson. Senator Benson is serving her fourth term in the Minnesota Senate. She represents District 31. She's a member of the Human Services Reform Committee, the Finance Committee, and is chair of the Health and Human Services Finance and Policy Committee. Senator Benson was raised on a farm in the Western Minnesota community of Murdoch and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry from St. Catherine University in St. Paul. She later attended the University of St. Thomas, where she earned her MBA. Senator Benson maintains an inactive CPA because her background includes some audit and consulting work at Deloitte, as well as the executive director at the Upper Midwest Security Alliance. She also currently serves as a board member for the Challenger Learning Center of Minnesota and the Way of the Shepherd Montessori School. It's with great pleasure and many thanks to Senator Benson in leading us through this very important discussion. Senator Benson.
I want to thank you very much. And thanks to everyone at Twin Cities Diversity in Practice and the Wanton Injustice Legal Detail. I appreciate this opportunity. I'm excited to have this conversation about an initiative that can be a catalyst for improving education for all of Minnesota's children. I believe that every child in the state of Minnesota has a unique potential and that our public education system must bolster each child to reach that potential. Too many children have been failed by our current education system, and our worst in the nation education disparities prove that we're long overdue for serious reform. For several years, the legislature has attempted to reform the education system, including a focus on literacy, but inertia of the status quo resists that reform. The Page Amendment will ignite further reforms and empower more members of the community, not just members of the legislature, to transform education and unlock each child's potential. So I look forward to hearing from Chief Justice Magnuson and Justice Page on the legal implications of the amendment and the importance of the Skeen decision. I'd like to introduce two gentlemen I've had the opportunity to work with as partners on this legislation. First, Neel Kashkari, the key driver and co-founder of the initiative to pass this constitutional amendment, and Minnesota's own Federal Reserve President, Neel Kashkari. Neel is president at the Minneapolis Fed, one of the Federal Reserve System's 12 regional banks. He's held a variety of roles in public service and finance, most notably Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in 2008 during the financial crisis, where he oversaw TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. I'm also proud to introduce the namesake of the bill and the other co-founder of the initiative to provide all Minnesota children with the right to a quality education, Justice Alan Page. Alan Page is co-founder of the Page Education Foundation and established with his wife Diane to support Minnesota students of color in pursuing post-secondary education. He served for 22 years as an Associate Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court. Let me give you a legislative overview. So I'm chief author of the Page Amendment in the Senate, and it's been a great experience to work with a broad coalition to build bipartisan support. I'd like to give you a quick overview of what needs to happen in order to get this bill on the ballot in 2022. The legislature must pass a constitutional amendment to get it on the ballot, but we do not need a governor's signature. In the Senate, the bill is 2563. The co-authors are John Howe and John Hoffman. It will travel through 4 or 5 legislative committees, including Education, Civil Law and Data Practices, the Judiciary Committee, and Elections, which is part of State Gov, and then Rules Committee. House File 874 is being authored by Representative Hassan, with co-authors Krisha, Chang, Erickson, and 14 other bipartisan members. It will follow a similar path through committees. It's unique. This bill is unique in that it does have supporters from the Metro and Greater Minnesota, across party lines, and across diverse educational experiences. This is really important given how divided the legislature has been, and the fact that we do have Republicans in one house or one body, and then Democrats in charge of the other body. And so, let's see, our legal conversations, there we go. I'm trying to follow a script, and I apologize if we're in person. This might be a little bit easier, but I want to introduce Justice Magnuson. As we talk about the legal implications of the Page Amendment, Justice Magnuson and Justice Page will be an important voice as you learn and debate this piece of legislation. And so Justice Magnuson, as you all know, served as Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court from 2008 to 2010, focusing almost exclusively on state and federal appellate courts. Eric is regarded as one of the most effective appellate lawyers in Minnesota and in the 8th Circuit. And in more than 45 years of practice, he has handled hundreds of appeals involving a wide range of issues, including the constitutionality of the public school finance system, employment law, trust and probate matters, trade secrets, business contracts, corporate fraud, insurance law, and professional liability. So, and I think we go now to Mr. Kashkari.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for your leadership and your passionate work on this proposal and for the children of Minnesota. Thank you, Justice Magnuson, Justice Page. Thank you, Anna, and all of the attendees who are here today. This is a high-powered legal discussion, and so I'm going to get out of the way very quickly. But I wanted to just spend a few minutes and tell you why the Minneapolis Fed is at the table. 113 or so years ago, the US Congress created the Federal Reserve System. And one of the goals that they've assigned us is maximum employment. as many Americans as possible gainfully employed and contributing to our economy. Well, the research is clear. There is no bigger, more important determinant of an individual's success in the job market than the education and the training that they have. It is that foundational to all of our economic futures. And so the Minneapolis Fed for 20 years has cared a lot about education, has been a pioneer in championing early childhood education. And this work with Justice Page and Senator Benenson and the other legislative leaders really builds on that work that we're so proud of. And so I'm going to go through some slides very quickly just to talk about the economics of why we're here. And then I'm going to hand it over to Justice Page to talk about the amendment. This chart here shows you on the Minneapolis Fed's website, we've created a new tool that accesses the latest data from Minnesota's Department of Education on education outcomes. And you can look at it statewide, you can look at it by different school districts, you can look at it by legislative districts, say, how are kids doing? And you can see here that across Minnesota, on all grades for math, if you just look at the dark blue, you've got 44% who are proficient at grade level. And then if you look at for students with free and reduced price lunches, that's the light green, and then yellow, students of color, 23, 27%. You know, Minnesotans tend to believe that our schools are doing great and all of our kids are doing great. You look at the data, it's just not true. Minnesota needs to be doing a lot better for all of our students, but especially for our low-income students and our children of color. And so we have a lot of work to do. And I'm not going to go into this in detail. You all can go to the Minneapolis Fed's website. I would encourage you to do that. I would encourage you to look up your own neighborhood school and determine how are they actually doing? Are they preparing their children for success? Next slide, please. So these are gaps. If you look fourth grade in the far left in math and eighth grade reading, students graduating within 4 years. The bottom line is you see huge gaps. White students are, again, by this measure, 64% proficient in math in fourth grade, only 47% proficient by eighth grade. So we're losing a lot of students between 4th and 8th grade. And then if you look at students of color in yellow, 33% down to 25%. 1 in 4 students of color are proficient in 8th grade at math, 1 in 4. And then low income students, that's the green bar, only 19% of 8th grade low income students are actually proficient in math. I mean, we're leaving a ton of students behind, and that's devastating for those individual students and their families, but it's devastating for our communities and it's devastating for our economy. Next slide, please. This is Minnesota's rank among all 50 states and the District of Columbia for gaps in 4-year graduation rates. Again, we're at the bottom. I mean, there's no other way to put it. We're at the bottom. And so Minnesotans love to tell themselves that we're at the top, we're Minnesota. It's time we took a hard look in the mirror and see how we're actually doing. We're at the bottom. This is our future workforce. This is about the economics. So where are our students coming from? So in 2018, roughly 20% of our students were considered BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. By 2050, it's going to be 37%. The bottom line is our workforce of the future are coming from many of the communities that we are leaving behind today. And so if you are a big employer in Minnesota, I'm really proud of the fact that so many businesses in Minnesota are strongly supporting the Page Amendment. They're doing it both because it's the right thing to do and it's the economic thing to do. I mean, these are their future customers and their future employees. And they're saying, if we want to continue to grow our businesses and grow them here in Minnesota, we need workers and we cannot keep leaving so many young people behind. You know, Justice Page, I reached out to Justice Page 2 years ago and I asked him, is there a way, I'm not a lawyer, is there a way we could use the law to literally put children first? And we started by looking at the Minnesota Constitution that Anna talked about. And we saw that Minnesota's Constitution has this antiquated education provision from 1857. Well, a lot of states have updated their constitutions on education. Minnesota is an outlier that we never have. In the late 90s, if you look at this data, in the late 90s, look on the right-hand side of the chart. Florida and Minnesota, where by this data is actually 2003, were roughly ranked evenly in terms of test score gaps across socioeconomic status. Florida was 30th, we were 34th. In the late 90s, Florida amended their constitution and said their children deserve a quality public education. And then following that amendment, the governor and the legislature came together and passed sweeping reforms. 20 years later, actually 16 years later on the right, Minnesota has gone from 34th to 35th place. We've gone backwards one spot in terms of gaps across socioeconomic status. Florida has gone from 30th to 6th. That's in only 16 years. And so this is not an impossible problem to solve if we actually have the political will to put children first. And that's why I'm so excited about the amendment proposal that we have developed, is it literally updates our Constitution by putting children first. And it says that every child in Minnesota deserves a quality public education, and then makes delivering on that the state's highest priority. And so we're not saying, hey, Minnesota should be just like Florida, but we're saying if Floridians can do it, there's no reason the Minnesotans can't do it. I don't believe that Florida families are somehow better than Minnesota families. You know, Florida has poverty too. Florida has challenges too, yet they can make these kind of dramatic strides. So can we. So let's go to the next slide. So our proposals on the left, I'll say one more thing before I turn it over to Justice Page. This is the proposal that Justice Page and I have put forward. We're so proud and so honored that Senator Benson has taken this. She's made her own tweaks to the language and put her proposal forward in the Senate. Ultimately, the final language of any legislation will be up to the legislature. It will be up to Senator Benson, her colleagues in the Senate, their colleagues in the House. But to us, the critical elements of this are a fundamental right to a quality public education, and for all students, not for some students, and that this should be the state's highest priority. And you know, we're really proud to partner with Senator Benson and grateful for her leadership. And so with that, let me turn it over to Justice Page to offer his perspective.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Senator Benson and Chief Justice Magnuson. Let me begin with a little bit of why I come to this. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a household where my parents knew and understood the importance and value of education. They understood that education was a tool that could be used to help me achieve my goals and my hopes and dreams for the future. I also grew up at a time when state-sponsored segregation still existed in this country. And they understood and impressed upon me that being educated, being a good student, having a good education could be a tool to overcome some of the discrimination that flowed from living in a segregated society. That's where it began. And over the years, the last 60 plus years, I've spent a great deal of time in schools and classrooms across Minnesota and across the country, talking with and to young children from kindergarten, actually preschool, through their last year in high school. And the one thing I've been convinced of is that every child that I've spent time with in a classroom was curious, had an interest in learning, and wanted to improve their status in terms of education. But that for far too many of them, they knew and understood that they were being left behind. And so that by the time they get to middle school and high school, that curiosity, that enthusiasm had waned, and that, as they say, they understood that they were being left behind. When Neil contacted me a couple of years ago to talk about these, what we like to call unacceptable gaps in opportunity and disparities in performance, I leaped at the chance because it was an opportunity to do something concrete to change the future. And why change the future? Well, first of all, education and having a good education is a tool that can help us fulfill our promise of justice for all. That is very important to me. The other aspect of this is that educational justice is related to economic justice, health justice, housing justice, social justice, and racial justice. And if we want to begin to get at some of the challenging and difficult problems we have in those areas, education lies at its base. You know, the reality is that every child that gets left behind is a diminished member of our society, of our community. They are a diminished employee, a diminished taxpayer, and more likely to become a burden on our community and on our society. And we have the power to change that. And so I feel very fortunate to have been involved in this work with Neel. And could we have that slide back up just for 1 second? I would like to point out a couple of things before we move on. Our current constitutional language focuses on the system, the education system, and the funding of that system. Our proposed language would shift that focus to include children. Indeed, our proposed amendment puts children first, making education a fundamental right, making, I shouldn't say education, a quality education, not only a quality education, but a quality public education, a fundamental right. Our amendment would define in broad terms what constitutes a quality public education. That is an education that fully prepares children for participation in our economy, our democracy, and our society. It would require accountability, and it would make education the highest priority of the state. It would be a paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools. There is nothing else in the Minnesota Constitution that is categorically set out as a paramount duty. By doing that, we can not only shift the focus to children, but to the education of individual children. And I think that can not only be a catalyst, but it can be transformative. And so I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Justice Page. Let's move on to a discussion of the Skeen case with Justice Magnuson and Justice Page. Who would like to go first, Justice Page or Justice Magnuson?
Well,
I learned a long time ago to defer to the chief.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today to participate in this important discussion. I was one of the lawyers for some of the parties in the Skeen case. And I'll give you a little background of the genesis of Skeen. At that time, there was a lot of litigation around the country over the fundamental adequacy of funding education, particularly in states like Texas, where all funding was local. There were many lawsuits brought saying that you're just not providing any kind of level of adequate funding for the education of our children. And since in Texas, for example, it's not an obligation of the state, but it's an obligation of the local governments, the counties, to provide that, it was a ripe area for litigation. That got transferred, that impetus moved to Minnesota, where there's a fundamentally different system. We had a constitutional provision, we still have it, that makes it the obligation of the state to fund the education system. And the attack was a little different here in Minnesota. The question was the overall adequacy or inadequacy of the system, but really the subtext was that because certain districts had the ability, because of their tax base and the will of their citizens, to supplement the basic funding that the state provided and have enriched programs. I know when my kids were young, they're all in their 30s and 40s now, but when they were young, we looked around. We wanted to move to the area that had the best schools, and that's a pretty common concern for young parents. Well, you would distinguish between one school district and another basically by the level of funding that the local government would add to the state government. Skeen was actually a very narrow decision. Now, to the court's credit, it recognized that education is a fundamental right. Now, for those lawyers in the audience, you understand that when you define something as a fundamental right, then the courts have a different way of looking at legislation that affects that right, strict scrutiny as opposed to rational basis. And there was a lot of discussion in both the majority opinion, the concurring opinion by Justice Tomjanovich, and the dissent by Justice Page and Gardebring about the level of scrutiny. But the bottom line was all the court felt it could decide and did decide was whether there had been a showing that the funding level was inadequate, that it was below the minimum that you needed to have a school system that worked. Not a very inspiring decision to say, well, it doesn't suck that bad, so it's not unconstitutional. But you know, in the most basic terms, that's what it said. Now, Justice Page in his dissent said, look, unequal funding fails strict scrutiny. You can't give more to some children than others if those children have the same rights. But remember, the constitutional provision didn't talk about children. It talked about the system. And if courts are anything, they are very aware of the limits of their ability to rule on matters that really aren't squarely before them. Courts don't make policy. They adjudicate claims that it may attack policy, but they do so in a very confined way. And so that brings us to the current amendment. It moves children to the forefront. It moves the education of children to the forefront. And rather than measuring the adequacy or inadequacy of a general funding system, it will require the legal analysis to focus on the children and whether they are receiving the education they need to become productive citizens in this state. There is no question the current education system, despite everyone's best efforts, has allowed dramatic gaps in grade based readiness between white and non-white students and between rich and poor students. That can't continue. As the slide from the Fed shows, in the future, those non-white students, those students from disadvantaged economic circumstances are going to become major players in the economy of this state. And it just makes all the sense in the world economically to make sure that they are equipped. And you know, beyond that, it's just the right thing to do. And that's why I think that the amendment is so vital to the future of our state.
And I would, if I might, I would just add, you know, the Skeen court held that the system as it existed and as it exists presumably today was adequate. And so it focused on the adequacy of the system. And it went further and said, if the state provides, and this was all about funding, the state provides basic funding that was enough to satisfy the adequacy requirement. As the chief noted, I dissented in Skeen, noting that an adequate system essentially doesn't necessarily mean that the education being received is adequate, and that a system that funds some students at a higher level than others can't be adequate. Needless to say, one of the things that you do in courts is count votes. That's how decisions get made. And Justice Gardebring and I didn't have the votes to prevail. And thus that brings us to today, putting children first, making not only the education they receive, bringing that to the forefront, but ensuring that not only are they being successful, but that the system itself is held accountable for providing that quality and that quality level of education.
I think the important thing to keep in mind also is that courts don't make policy. They apply the law. And the impetus for achieving some solution to the incredible gap that we have in our education system now has to lie outside of the judiciary. It has to be a constitutional amendment so that the courts then have the tool to address the issue when it's brought back to them.
Indeed, the language of the proposed amendment was designed to do just that, to give courts the tool, if necessary, to make sure that each child's right to a quality public education could be vindicated.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to ask Neel and our two justices, if the Page Amendment is adopted, how would you hope the Minnesota public education system would look in 10 years, 20 years, et cetera? What benchmarks should we be measuring against, and what would they look like in your vision?
Well, let me just jump in. Constitutional language generally is not so specific as to give details, and our language is consistent with that. I mean, the language is sort of our guiding principle, and so the language itself doesn't specify, unlike, quite frankly, the language in the amendments that Florida made in their constitution. Our proposed amendment doesn't do that. But in my vision and my hope is that what will flow from our proposed amendment is an education system that focuses on educating individual children in a way that will allow individual children to achieve their highest potential, whatever that is. Will give them the opportunity to do that. It will give them the tools to succeed. Clearly that's not happening today. Our system focuses on the general, sort of the idealized child. And if you fall on the, at the higher end of the spectrum, that's fine. If you fall on the lower end of the educational spectrum, that's fine too. I think if we can focus on individual children, we can elevate everybody's not only opportunity, but abilities. And interestingly, let me just digress here for a moment. If you looked at those slides earlier that Neel was showing, I think the one slide showed proficiency at, it was either reading or math at 62%. That's for all students. That's for the wealthy students. That's for the disadvantaged students. That's for students of color, all students. That's kind of shocking. That's kind of shocking that only 62% of our children are either reading or doing math at grade level. This proposed amendment would benefit all students. And maybe some of those numbers, because they're the most recent, are down because of the pandemic. But I think even pre-pandemic, back in 2018, 2019, I think the proficiency was something under 70%. And in some respects, we're leaving all of our children behind.
From a judicial perspective, the current system focuses on inputs. The amendment will make the legal inquiry focus on outputs. It's currently focused on resources. The amendment will focus on results. And when I say give the tools to the courts that they need to address kind of the bigger problem, they now would have a constitutional basis for judging the results. Right now, they only have a constitutional basis for judging the inputs. And that's just not the right measure.
And Neel, Mr. Kashkari, if the amendment's adopted, how would you hope public education would be different 10 years from now? Our two justices talked about measuring output, and that the court would look at those outputs. So what would those outputs be and how would they be different?
Well, I go back, and again, with not being a lawyer myself, I look at the education system we have. As Justice Page and I started working together, when we looked at the Constitution, we realized that Minnesota's education system today is performing exactly as the Constitution prescribes it to perform. A system that is on average adequate, great for some, lousy for others. So this is a chance, as we see it, to start anew, to say, let's go build and create the education system of the future for our children today and in the future, for our economy, society, and democracy of the future. And one thing that Justice Page said that I want to reiterate is the language in the draft is not prescriptive. It doesn't specify class sizes or curriculums or teaching methods. We think that that is best left up to the parents and teachers to decide what's best for their children. And that will probably vary across the state. Well, what kids need in St. Paul may be different than what kids need in Duluth or in Winona. Their parents and their teachers are in the best position to design that education for their kids. And so what do I hope the outcomes are that are different? I hope that much higher percentage of Minnesota kids are reading at grade level, can do math at grade level, have the basic skills necessary to succeed in whatever they choose to do. If they want to go to college, great. They've got the tools necessary to go to college and be successful. Or if they want to go into the workforce, they've got the skills necessary to be successful in that workforce. That's it. It's about empowering each of our Minnesota kids with the education that they deserve so they can reach his or her full potential. And it's not going to happen overnight, but that Florida data is really something. I mean, in 16 years, Florida has moved leaps and bounds beyond Minnesota in educating its low-income kids and its children of color. And I'm going to repeat what I said at the start. I don't believe that Floridians are somehow better than Minnesotans. So I don't think there's something fundamentally different. They had the political will to put children first. What this amendment gives us the chance to do is to join hands across the aisle and say, time is up. Let's put Minnesota kids first.
And thank you. We do have some audience questions coming in. What do you mean by quality education and quality public schools. I think Mr. Kashkari can start there. And just as a reminder, we have about 10 minutes for the remainder of the discussion.
Well, if you ask me to start, I'm happy to start, and then I'll turn it to Justice Page. In the language itself of the proposal, it says each child will have the skills necessary for full participation in the economy, our democracy, and society. So that's a high-level concept of what quality means. But once this amendment passes, the hard work is really going to begin with the parents and teachers and legislators and school board members and administrators coming together to flush out exactly what we mean by quality and how we measure quality. You know, what we can't do right now, some education leaders today say, look, we're making progress, graduation gaps are closing. Well, if we're not careful, we could just graduate everybody tomorrow and pretend that we would have solved the problem, and we would have solved nothing. So we absolutely do need standards, and we need to measure to make sure that kids are being fully prepared. But I know that Justice Page and I both agree the current assessment tool, the MCAs, is a really crude instrument that is not up to the task. We can do a lot better than that. But with that snapshot of quality, let me turn it over to Justice Page.
Well, Neel, I think you captured it. Quality is defined. Quality will exist when all children receive an education that fully prepares them with the skills necessary. That's critical. You know, in the ideal world, we would, as we go through the legislative process and get this on the ballot, we would simultaneously be designing what that education system looked like and putting the meat on the bones, if you will, of what quality is and how you get there. But unfortunately, we don't live in the ideal world. But I think from a legal standpoint, courts will be able to understand that quality is something different than adequate, that focus on children is something different than focus on the system, and that if necessary, and quite frankly, I'm not convinced that in the first instance anyway, that litigation will be the first tool that we'll be using to ensure quality. I think it'll be when we give parents and children, along with teachers, administrators, our elected officials, the power to design the system. I have faith that they will design a system that will end up eliminating these gaps that we see.
Okay, thank you. Our next question to Justice Magnuson. The current clause requires a uniform system of public schools, but the proposed amendment removes the text. This phrase has been litigated many times and has substantial precedent. What are your views on how the new language would impact the body of precedent? And are you concerned about removing the uniformity requirement and that it would promote segregation in schools?
No, I don't see that as an outcome at all. Remember, the amendment does not eliminate uniformity. It simply focuses that uniformity on the child as opposed to the system. And you know, there is a rich world out there of different ways to achieve the desired results. But what the amendment will do is it will force the legislature and the educators to make this a priority. I mean, you could, I suppose, conceivably achieve all of these things without a constitutional amendment, but we haven't in the last 30 years because there are lots of different things that our legislators and our educators have to focus on. Showing a commitment to the children as opposed to the system is going to put this on the front burner. It's going to make it the priority for actions going forward. And I think that investing in the future is absolutely critical. And it will be an expression of the will of the people that this is a paramount obligation of the state. We have to treat our children better than we've been treating them. And so I don't see uniformity disappearing because the standards will apply to everyone, but the focus will be on the children, not the system.
And Senator, may I add two quick things? First of all,
And of course,
Chief Justice,
Mr. Kashkari.
I couldn't agree more with you. You know, and in some of our early conversations with some legislators said, oh, we don't need this amendment. We can do this ourselves. And we said exactly what you said. Well, what have you been waiting for? You've had years or decades at this. And so just saying we can do it doesn't mean we will do it. And just as you said, Chief Justice, this is the people speaking about where their highest values are. And then this notion, you know, we've come across so many people who've come up with creative ways to defend the status quo. One of my favorites is this argument that there's this body of law that is anchored in the foundation of the current clause, and we'll lose that if we improve it. You know, there was a body of law founded in slavery too. I mean, we're never going to improve society if we simply say, well, there's this body of law that's anchored in the way we've always done things. And so the way we've always done things have gotten us to where we are. Does anybody in Minnesota think that's okay? I would hope the answer is no.
Right, and the body of law, I mean, courts follow precedent. The body of law has only addressed that which the courts can address. Courts don't design things. They don't create educational systems. They need to have some concrete grant of legal authority before they stick their nose into things. And that's what this does. It gives the courts, as I said, the tool to make sure that we are treating our children the way we should.
And I would just say,
We do have a lot of questions coming in, and so I think we need to move to the one that's getting the most attention. Let's start with Mr. Kashkari. The current education clause expressly requires the legislature to fund schools by taxation or otherwise. The Page Amendment removes that requirement. Why did you remove that language, and how do you ensure adequate funding?
Well, I'm going to turn it actually to Justice Page.
Great.
Because this is really a legal question.
it's really kind of simple. You can't meet a paramount duty if you don't fund it. It's that simple.
And so I just want to clarify, the removing by taxation doesn't prohibit the legislature from taxing for the purposes of funding education.
Absolutely not. I mean, the only way, as you know, Senator, the only way anything gets funded is through the legislative action. And
we did settle, because there was a point when the courts were appointing special masters and appropriating money, but that is settled now. And so you're right, only the legislature can appropriate funds.
And I dare say, even though there may have been a settlement where a court said X, Y, Z, that the legislature had to take action in order to put that in the form of a bill signed by the governor to get things done.
Yes, yes.
So I mean, at the core, the legislature has to act and be involved.
And in slight defense of the legislature, even though this is a judicial forum, we have passed the Florida literacy language several times, just not getting it signed into law. So there is, once the amendment passes, there needs to be specific action. And the court can only act on quality when quality is defined. Let me see about some other questions that we can go to here. And I'll throw this out to the gentleman as our last question. The listeners here from the legal community, what would you like them to do after they hear the summary of these conversations? So let's start with Justice Page, Mr. Kashkari, then Justice Magnuson, and this will be our last question for the day.
Well, we would love to have, both on an individual basis, but also on a collective basis, their support. We would like to have lawyers both lend their voices at the legislature to talk to their friends and family about the importance of this. We would love to have them engaged in the discussion. And, when we get it on the ballot, we would love to have them involved in ensuring that every child's right to a quality public education is vindicated.
And to Mr. Kashkari.
Thank you, Senator. Just agree with everything Justice Page said. And just a reminder, systems perform the way they are designed. The Minnesota education system is performing exactly as it was designed to perform. And whenever a system is this big, and it's been around for 150 years, the bureaucracy emerges around it to protect it and to avoid changes. The only way we're going to change the system is if the people of Minnesota demand that we change the system. The Page Amendment is a chance to build a new education system, to envision and build a new education system for the future of Minnesota. I would just challenge you to say, does anybody think that the state of Minnesota deserves an education system grounded in 1857? I would tell you the answer is no. And so I hope you agree with that, and I hope you will help us design and build that new system for the future. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Senator, and the justices.
And Justice Magnuson.
Constitutional amendments are hard to accomplish. They should be. The Constitution should be as reliable as possible. I have spent a lot of time working on a constitutional amendment to change the way we select our judges and justices. And we ran into what I would call constitutional amendment fatigue. People were just tired 3 or 4 years ago of all the different efforts to amend the Constitution. I think that we're past that now. I think that the citizens will not react negatively to, oh, just another constitutional amendment. Why are they bothering me with this? But it's really important for members of the legal community to explain to their friends and neighbors how this process works and why it's important. You need to get the citizens to understand they're voting on the future of their state. They're voting on their children's future. This isn't about, some pointy head legal scholars trying to figure out a way to fine tune the Constitution. This is a meat and potatoes. It's affecting your family in your community, everyday issue. And the solution that we haven't had for 30 years is to amend the Constitution so that this gets to the top of the consideration of the legislature and the courts. It is a paramount obligation. And I think that it's one of the most important opportunities the citizens of this state have had in years to shape the future of not just their government, not just their school system, but their lives and their children's lives. So lawyers, get out there and educate your family and colleagues and neighbors and even people you don't know.
And I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for the opportunity to work on this legislation. And I'd ask the audience, pay attention to the slides that were presented today. Minnesota had a reputation for a world-class education system not that long ago. So what's changed? Were we leaving people behind? How did we get from there to here? And how do we compete regionally, nationally, globally, if we aren't developing a workforce that makes it attractive to live and work in Minnesota? But more importantly, the moral imperative that there are children who are being left behind. And so I'd like you to look at the page amendment language, put it in the context of the Constitution. Read our Constitution. It is a beautifully crafted document. I know you spend a lot of time in the law, but if we step up, it is structured so that the paramount duty of the government right now is public safety. It's listed first. There are specific roles for the legislature and the judiciary and the executive, and understanding all of that as we fundamentally change this core document is going to be important in the legal conversation, I believe, and in the conversation at the legislature. And spend just a brief amount of time on 128.01 that talks about the education code. There are some, and 128.03, the mission statement of our education statute, because all of that will be impacted by the Page Amendment as we go forward. And getting this right matters. Constitutions aren't easy to change. And if we get this wrong, it's going to be stuck there for a long time. So we need diligent work, but more importantly, we need educated, ambitious people like yourself, people who have a strong voice in their community to understand what Mr. Kashkari presented and what it means for the children of Minnesota. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Samara Sharif for final closing statements.
Thank you so much, Senator Benson. And thank you to Anna Richo, Justice Page, Justice Magnuson, and also to President Neel Kashkari for their thoughts and their input today. And thank you all for joining us for this program. As we heard, access to education is an important issue that we face here in Minnesota. And with the introduction of the Page Amendment, we have a framework for how we can use the law and a constitutional amendment to help to move our public education system forward and make it work for all children. This program was like made possible through a partnership with like WILD and the Minneapolis like Federal Reserve and our children. And WILD's like vision is to create a Twin Cities community that is free of anti-Black racism and all forms of like racism. And we carry out WILD's mission with programs like the one you joined today, and with the work of like leaders like Anna Richo, who have given their time to furthering our mission. And WILD provides a platform through which the Twin Cities legal community can actively combat anti-Black racism and all forms of racism through partnerships with existing community organizations who are currently doing the work at this moment. We tackle important issues and we tackle the relevant topics such as education, public safety, and also voting rights and more. We took on this work because we know that if we're going to retain diverse talent here in the state, that our community must play a role in making our communities equitable for everyone. Our next program is on October 13th, and we'll be discussing question 2 on the city ballot, which, if passed by the voters, would eliminate the Minneapolis like police department and like replace it with a new Department of Public Safety. Please join us for another engaging discussion with experts who are going to be analyzing this important issue. And whether you live here in like Minneapolis or have questions about this initiative, please join us. You'll see a link in the chat for how to like register for that program. And be sure to follow TCDIP on LinkedIn and Twitter to stay up to date on our programs and events. And thank you again for joining us today for this program. We'll be sending out more information by email with the slides that you saw today. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.